Hello, BES. I'm James Hill at the Sustainability Research Institute in the University of East London, and I'm going to talk to you today about some of the work I've been doing relating to international comparisons of the biodiversity net gain metric. Um, so we know that biodiversity is in decline, with many calling it a sixth mass extinction event on the horizon. Um, Nations, in response to this, have set ambitious targets to halt and reverse biodiversity loss by 2030 under the Kunming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, perhaps the best known example of an international agreement to halt biodiversity loss. However, there is a significant financing gap uh, in relation to delivering on those aims, with the World Bank predicting a necessary $700 billion of financing needed to meet our biodiversity conservation and restoration targets, as we can see in this diagram here. Mobilizing private finance is going to be essential if we're going to meet these targets. Um, and amongst the proposed mechanisms for channeling private finance into conservation uh, biology, biodiversity offsetting or trading markets have emerged as the fastest growing area. They've garnered a lot of attention from policymakers, financiers, and academics as a result. However, the development of high integrity trading has been limited, in part due to a lack of agreed upon standardized metrics for biodiversity, which of course is often defined by its inherent complexity and variability. Um, in February 2024, the UK government released its own national biodiversity trading policy called Biodiversity Net Gain, or BNG for short, which has now made it a legal requirement for developers to replace and enhance any biodiversity that they destroy through their developments by at least 10%, with some regional authorities setting higher targets than that. These trade-offs are determined using a standardized biodiversity metric called the statutory biodiversity metric, which represents the value of biodiversity through units, the amount of which are determined by a combination of habitat size, distinctiveness, condition, and strategic significance. So what do these mean? Condition, a little complex. It's an assessment of the ecological representativeness of the habitat, or its health, you could say. So to what extent is it intact or degraded? Condition assessment criteria differ depending on the habitat, but they all take the form of rapid visual appraisals, which relate to the plant species richness and their composition. There are also factors relating to habitat structure and its functioning. Uh, um, so it's only been around in terms of its implementation time for around 2 years, but BNG is already being called the most ambitious biodiversity policy in the world, and other countries are now working to apply the framework and metric in the design of their own biodiversity policies. Um, and the UK government is promoting the metric as a tool which can be adapted for international use. However, the metric has yet to be tested in an objective fashion uh, in different ecological contexts. Um, so, for example, in countries that have considerably different biogeographic histories and landscapes. Um, New Zealand presents itself as an interesting and relevant testing ground for the biodiversity metric in this regard. So New Zealand has experimented with voluntary biodiversity trading for around 20 years, particularly in the mining and station, so ranching type contexts. However, it has never developed a mandatory policy of its own, in part due to the uncertainties of metric design. The UK and New Zealand have a number of similarities. They're both island nations with maritime climate and comparable GDP per capita, and land conversion represents the major threat to species in both countries. Um, However, there are significant differences between the two countries, providing a solid testing ground for the metric's international application. New Zealand has much higher species endemism rates due to its long history of isolation. Pest eradication, particularly of mammals and invertebrates, is a much greater conservation priority in New Zealand compared to the UK. New Zealand has a significantly lower population size and density, and of course, New Zealand also has to consider the history of Maori occupation and land use, an additional cultural element that also needs inclusion in policy. Um, so I visited New Zealand in the spring of this year to test the BNG condition assessment framework within habitats in New Zealand that have clear analogues to the UK: forests, wetlands, coastal, shrubland, and grassland ecosystems. To better understand how applicable BNG is in an international setting, and to understand what changes would be needed to make it more suitable. So for field testing, I took at least 3 different sites per habitat and surveyed at least 4 plots per site. Intact sites with lack of direct management or intervention were selected alongside clearly degraded sites to test the sensitivity of the criteria. And alongside fieldwork, I reviewed the New Zealand classification systems for habitat and policy documents to better understand the challenges and opportunities in designing a distinctiveness system for New Zealand habitat. So understanding where New Zealand sits in terms of nesting a BNG-like strategy within its own policy framework. So I'll try and briefly run through key findings from each of the habitat surveys. Uh, the metric proved to be quite well suited for differentiating structural and functional characteristics of forests in New Zealand. And this is likely due to the broad universality of these types of habitat characteristics as it relates to temperate forests across the world. Um, so it was able to discriminate between poor condition plantation forests, which we would anticipate to score poorly, given that they feature uniform monocultures of exotic pines and eucalyptus, say versus moderate condition native secondary forest and good condition intact forest, which featured highly complex structural conditions with a number of age classes, including very large emergent trees, seedlings, understories, and dead wood. So you can see here how these structural functional characteristics do map on well. However, the metric wasn't very well suited to differentiating plant species richness between the native forest types, since all these sites exceeded the +5 species threshold used in the UK condition assessments, reflecting quite obviously the naturally higher rates of species richness in New Zealand forests compared to the UK. Furthermore, a review of the New Zealand National Vegetation Survey database highlights that there is significant variability in the woody species richness amongst intact forest types in New Zealand, likely due to higher rates of regional endemism in New Zealand. Um, so making the metric rather poorly suited from a species richness and composition perspective, perhaps. Additionally, all native forests surveyed featured lianas and epiphytes, important functional guilds which add to habitat complexity, which are not featured in the UK metric. The condition criteria for wetlands were able to differentiate between 2 small and fragmented wetlands located quite close to urban developments, which scored poorly, featuring a history of drainage, management, and invasive species, versus an intact, good condition Pakehi wetland, which has not been directly disturbed for over 10,000 years, according to peat pollen records from the site. And the site also featured an entirely native species composition. So in that sense, the condition criteria worked rather well across these wetland habitat types. So this is likely due to the broad transferability of the criteria, which mainly relate to hydrology, pollution, and the presence of invasives. So again, universally applicable criteria here. There is also a criteria relating to the representativeness of native vegetation within the condition assessment criteria. So this can be assessed in reference to the Department of Conservation's wetland classification work. So there is an easy transferability in terms of nesting classification systems here, which works quite effectively. So similar to wetland, the coastal condition criteria proved to be broadly transferable again to the New Zealand context due to its focus on landscape processes. So heavily managed sites which featured artificial components like harbours or quarries, which clearly impacted on the natural coastal processes, scored lower than surveyed protected sites featured in the south of Wellington at the Tapaturanga Marine Reserve. So all sites also featured invasive species. This is a particular problem in the coastal context. And the Dune site near Hast, which is South Island, was prevented from scoring good condition due to the presence of abundant marram grass and gorse, which were found colonizing native sedge communities, which you can see in the picture here. It was also noted that xerophytic succulents like glassworts were common across coastal habitats in New Zealand, but these are absent in condition uh, in the UK condition assessment criteria, reflecting their broad absence in UK habitats. So that's an additional consideration that should be made. Shrubland habitats didn't fare nearly as well using the UK metric. So Manuka and Kanuka scrub, which is a highly abundant early successional type scrub community in New Zealand, scored poor compared to mixed scrub communities due to the lack of woody plant species present. But Manuka and Kanuka are naturally monodominant species. These are naturally monodominant communities, and they are widely regarded as valuable habitat for biodiversity in New Zealand, providing important nursery conditions for slower growing native forest species. So as a result, the true ecological value of these habitats are probably downplayed using the UK metric, which emphasizes species richness. And the same principle also applies to grassland habitats as well. So the condition criteria were unable to differentiate between heavily modified pasture communities featuring an abundance of non-native grazing stock species from Europe versus native tussock grasslands. And this is because native New Zealand grasslands are naturally species poor, and the UK metric requires grassland to have at least 6 native higher plant species per meter square to achieve moderate or good scoring. So this is rather unrealistic in New Zealand, um, where at least in upland communities, narrow-leaved snow tussock grassland tends to dominate throughout quite naturally. Um, the metric also failed to properly evaluate the tussock shrubland habitat. So the UK metric penalizes grassland communities which feature shrubs, which you can argue reflects a lack of consideration for the value of ecotonal habitat in the metric. But these mosaics are common in New Zealand and are valued for providing habitat for rare species. Take birds like the takahe and the kea, and reptiles like the ground skink. Finally, the presence of bracken within the metric results in penalties reflecting the bully-like status of bracken in the United Kingdom. In New Zealand, the native bracken also shares aggressive traits like the UK bracken, but is also valued by Maori as a traditional food source, creating a potential conflict of valuation between indigenous versus mainstream ecological viewpoint, which will need to be considered. Um, so a discussion of the findings. We've seen that the UK biodiversity metric criteria can be applied to forest, wetland, and coastal habitats at least to differentiate condition with limited modification. However, suitable plant species richness thresholds will be needed to be set for most of these habitats to account for wide differences in biogeographic history between New Zealand and the UK, with some thresholds needing to be set higher and others lower. Additional functional guilds found in New Zealand, but not so much in the UK, should also be included, and these could take the form of either abundance or richness counts. So, although the metric is sensitive to invasive plant species, um, and can easily integrate alongside regional invasive inventories for identification purposes, it is largely insensitive to other invasive pests that are important in New Zealand, so namely mammals and invertebrates. Perhaps additional criteria for pest trapping and monitoring could be established utilizing standard operating procedures set out by the Department of Conservation relating to best practice for pest control. And this would then help integrate any biodiversity trading policy with their current predator-free 2025 policy framework. And then, of course, as we've seen in relation to bracken, it's going to be important to bring Maori perspective into the fold when deciding on condition value, as this will need to be balanced alongside mainstream ecological opinion or scientific opinion. Finally, it's important to note that there are a range of entirely non-analogous habitats present in New Zealand due to the presence of volcanic activity, for example, and unique biotic drivers, which fell outside the scope of this study, and these will require entirely new condition assessments. Um, So this is an important consideration here in terms of the habitat typologies. There's currently no unified national New Zealand typology, so this creates a barrier for building a trading framework through that distinctiveness hierarchy that we have in the UK BNG policy. But there are potential ways of overcoming this by integrating a range of other classification systems that are already present in the country to build distinctiveness classes and establish upper limits on trading. And there are a number of social and strategic considerations as well that should be taken. So we should really try and learn from the first couple of years of implementation in the UK to improve upon any future biodiversity trading policies that are created. Um, we know from surveys that Maori hold a mixture of views on biodiversity trading mechanisms. So there is an example to co-design with Maori cooperation to avoid inequitable outcomes that have been seen in the UK in relation to socio-geographic factors. And there's opportunities to build Maori perspective into the metric itself. So the BNG metric here in the UK, there aren't really any social considerations contained within it, but a New Zealand metric could have multipliers for Maori participation, for using traditional management practices, and for targeting valuable, culturally valuable species like the tuna, the freshwater eel here, and the ponds that were traditionally dug as nurseries. There's a number of strategic considerations that could be made. So the UK framework is rather fragmented. It's focused on-site gains as opposed to off-site gains, which limits the scope in terms of strategic conservation funneling of finance. There are a number of systematic conservation planning tools like Marksan and Zonation that could be integrated alongside a trading framework to highlight the best opportunities for channeling finance into conservation. And these could be combined alongside community benefits. So, for example, targeting nature-based solutions for climate adaptation. So, for example, mangrove reforestation in terms of flood and storm protection. Um, so to conclude, uh, we've seen that BNG is transferable to New Zealand with modifications, at least in terms of the habitats that I surveyed, reinforcing BNG's position as an international benchmark, and its utility in the design of other trading policies. But it needs to be adapted for endemic species and habitats, additional functional guilds, and sensitive cultural contexts. Uh, the absence of a nationally standardized habitat typology remains an issue in New Zealand. However, there are a number of avenues for addressing this, as we've seen, and yeah, there's a significant opportunity to learn from BNG's first 2 years of implementation to build a more equitable and strategic trading system. So that's the end of the presentation. Thank you very much. I'll provide contact details if you have any questions. So thank you for your time.